We were reading in the last class a very interesting paragraph which is pretty unique in all of Sri Aurobindo's writings, in the sense he is describing the intimate relationship between Purusha and Prakriti, but in the journey of Satyavan, Ashwapati, what we see is actually he first realizes the incapability of the human beings, and therefore he goes away from humanity, ascends further, comes to a level of the Godheads who, unlike the normal, usual belief, are not that much involved in the human, if I can say the word, affairs, in the sense they are pretty much aloof, not participating actively in the human sorrow and grief. Although human beings, we believe they are responding to us, it is those Godheads who are on the lower level, what we call the vital level perhaps, are the ones who respond to the human prayers, grief, sorrow and suffering, because they want to participate in these human affairs more for their own gratification. But the Godheads of the higher levels, who are impartial, who are pretty much aloof, and it is as if, as Sri Aurobindo described in many a way, they are untouched by this human sorrow and suffering. They leave, or they take this stand of aloofness, disinterestedness, because they take the side of the divine law, and they feel it is that divine law which will ultimately prevail. So they should not intervene in the evolutionary process. They support the general lines of the process, but not really intervene or interrupt or interfere. But that's not the end or the highest realm of the hierarchy of the worlds. If this impartial Godheads were the end of the world, the creation would have been pretty much different. But that's not the truth. Ashwapati goes further. He ascends further. And beyond these Godheads, he comes to the truth of Purusha and Prakriti. And there he finds a completely different world, a completely different world of relations. It is a world based on love, where the truth is the truth of love, where the truth is where the divine is involved. Not only is he concerned with the human grief and sorrow and all that, but he is intimately involved with nature, with Prakriti, with creation. So what we see is this kind of a difference between the human level, the lower Godheads, the higher Godheads, and the Supreme God, the Godhead or the Divine, or what we call the aspects of Purusha and Prakriti. So what we see here in these lines is that the Purusha is so much immanent. He is part and parcel of this creation. So it is not the question of he wanting to involve, he responding to the human beings. He is part of this nature, of this Prakriti of human beings. So it is the Creator who is in absolute, intimate, involved love with Prakriti. So, as I told you in my last class, it is not the question of God, the Creator, and the created. There is no difference between the created and the Creator. He is in play, in the constant Leela. And this is a play of divine love, divine unity, intimacy, frolic, fun. And this is the description that we have been getting on page 61, and we came down to the first few lines of page 62 in book 1, canto 4. So I'll read out a few lines and then try to see what are the relations that come forth. Of all the marvel and beauty that are hers, only a darkened little we can feel. He too wears a diminished Godhead there. He has forsaken his omnipotence. His calm he has forgone an infinity. So this is the involvement that I am speaking of. That the divine, the Purusha has forsaken his omnipotence and he has forgone his calm, his quietness, his infinity. It reminds us of Sri Aurobindo's poem, God's Labour, where he writes, coercing my Godhead, I have come down. So this is the nature of the avatar, that he leaves his omnipotence, his infinity, his calm realms, and then he comes down. That's the avataric birth. But here, there's a little different meaning where the divine Purusha is saying he has forgone all that and he has come down. Not only come down into the human level, into the human beings or into this creation, but look at this. He says he knows her. Her is the Prakriti. He knows her only. He has forgotten himself. You see, this is the magnificent relation that we see, that he has involved himself so much with this Prakriti, with this creation, that he has forgotten himself. You see, this self-forgetfulness of the divine, the Creator in the creation, is a pretty unique concept. I mean, we do not see in any other philosophy or religion this kind of a self-forgetfulness of the divine in the creation. There is always a kind of an objectivity other religions and philosophies have kept between the creation and the Creator. But here Sri Aurobindo makes them one, because as I always quote, and that's a most beautiful quotation which brings out the full meaning, what the Mother herself said, Without him I exist not, without me he is unmanifest. So this manifestation aspect of the Shakti is what Sri Aurobindo is bringing out here. So in this manifestation, the Shakti manifests, but manifests whom? The Purusha, the consciousness. So the Chit Shakti is inseparably one. So where there is creation, where it is because of the Shakti, and the Shakti has in her womb nothing but the Supreme Creator. So you see, to that extent that he knows her only, he has forgotten himself. To her he abandons all to make her great. This is what we have in the Gita, the sacrifice of the Purusha. I mean, the Purusha sacrifices himself, forgets himself, and abandons all to make her. Her is the Prakriti. Her great. So it is as if he is standing behind and says, no Prakriti, you do everything. I give you the command, you take over. So this is the sacrifice of the Purusha, that leaving his omnipotence, he has come down into this finite world. But Sri Aurobindo mentions something different in the small book, De Mother. He calls it the sacrifice of the divine Shakti, the divine mother. There's a little difference of concept between the Gita and Sri Aurobindo here. In one there is a sacrifice of the Purusha, here there is a sacrifice of the divine Shakti. However, the meaning is the same, that there is this forgetfulness, abandoning of himself. He hopes in her to find himself anew, incarnate, wedding his infinity's peace to her creative passion's ecstasy. You see, try to see, it's a very, very difficult concept in a way, that this could be the intimacy, self-forgetfulness of the Purusha, and we'll see why it happens, but let's get along. He hopes in her to find anew, incarnate, wedding his infinity's peace. You see, he has come into her womb, he has come into Prakriti to find himself anew, once again. But in this once again is the process of evolution. That the divine has lost himself, has forgotten himself in this creation, and that is what we call the involution. And evolution is nothing but the self-finding of himself in this creation. So he is incarnating, and what is this incarnation? It is incarnation of what we say, the Atman, the soul, the psychic being. It's nothing but, this is one philosophy, this is one concept, but philosophically, it's the birth of the psychic being in nature, in the forms of creation. So he says, wedding his infinity's peace, what he had, that infinity's peace, to her creative passion's ecstasy. Although possessor of the earth and heavens, he leaves to her the cosmic management and watches all, the witness of her scene. You see, this is a magnificent relation. I mean, it's not difficult to understand if those of you who are here who know, if you know well the life of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. You see, after 1926, this was exactly the relation that we see between Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. He leaves to her the cosmic management and watches all, the witness of her scene. So it's the mother who was running the show, she was the executrix, she was the person who was organizing, and Sri Aurobindo was in his room watching, guiding, but not involving himself. And he involved himself only through the mother, as much as possible. So this is the relation on the human physical level, but on the Godhead's level also the same thing. And this cosmic management is interesting. This morning I had a visitor from Calcutta, We are talking about the management of the mothers, how the mothers coming on 29th of March, 100 years back. And how if the mother had not come, how Sri Aurobindo Ashram would not have existed. And perhaps as a corollary, even Aurobindo wouldn't have seen the light of day. It is she who manifests. She is the organizer. She is the manager, the cosmic manager. And then when I was talking to him about this, he says it's a similar situation in Bengal. It seems Swami Vivekananda said, if Sri Ramakrishna goes away, it doesn't much matter. If the mother goes away, then there will be, as they said in Bengali, there will be a kando. Kando means there will be some kind of a turmoil. Because the mother, the Sri Ma, she was the manifestation of Sri Ramakrishna again. So wherever there is a Shakti, there is the aspect of Prakriti. It is she who has manifested Sri Ramakrishna. It is the mother who has manifested Sri Aurobindo. In fact, Nolinida, in one of his reminiscences, he writes that the first 12 years from 1920 to 1932, no, it's actually 1926. The first 6 years they were together, but 1926, from the time the ashram was made, so 1938, the mother really manifested Sri Aurobindo in the sense that up until 1920-26, the disciples took Sri Aurobindo more as a master, as a guru. It was, the guru in the Indian sense, the spiritual master. But after 26 till 38, is the mother who established Sri Aurobindo as the avatar, as the divinity. And people started looking upon him not just as a guru, but as the divine incarnation, the incarnation of the supermind, the avatar of the supermind. And then interestingly he notes that after 38, when there was the accident in Sri Aurobindo's thigh, then the next 12 years, from 38 to 50, Sri Aurobindo established as the mother. That means in his treatment, in the way he writes to the people, he says, no, go to the mother. Her divinity was established. So it's a very interesting relation. The first 12 years, mother establishes Sri Aurobindo. The next 12 years, Sri Aurobindo establishes the mother as the divine consciousness. So it was an interesting play here between mother and Sri Aurobindo. But what he writes here in the poem, he leaves to her the cosmic management and watches all, the witness of her scene. And that's why I had asked you, I don't know if some of you had time to read Nirod Baran's 12 years with Sri Aurobindo. This is exactly the relation that comes out there. A supernumerary on her stage, he speaks no words or hides behind the wings. He takes birth in her world, waits on her will, divines her enigmatic gestures sense, the fluctuating chance turns of her mood, works out her meanings she seems not to know, and serves her secret purpose in long time. You see, there is this complete surrender. He doesn't impose himself. Although he is the possessor of the earth and heavens, he is the creator, he is the Purusha. And yet in this Leela, he doesn't dominate. He is very much behind. He says, he takes birth in her world, he speaks no words or hides behind the wings. He's always a kind of a second flute, the second string, he will not dominate. He's just working from behind the screen. He doesn't speak words or hide behind his wings. He takes birth in her world, waits on her will. He takes birth, as we know, is incarnated as a psychic being. Again and again he comes as a psychic being in all the forms and waits on her will. Divines her enigmatic gestures sense, works out her meanings she seems not to know. Everywhere he adds a meaning, a direction to her actions. The Prakriti moves on with a tremendous energy, creating, destroying, moving on as if without direction. But the Purusha is this inner being, the psychic being, the soul. With this aspiration, he says, no, life is not just a meandering, just growing up and growing old and passing away. There's a meaning. in our growth, in this incessant energy that is there, pushing us forwards, not only time-wise, not only age-wise, but in this energy of consciousness, there is a direction. So he gives a meaning. As one too great for him, he worships her. He adores her as his regent of desire. He yields to her as the mover of his will. He burns the incense of his nights and days, offering his life a splendor of sacrifice. You see, this relationship of love between the created Purusha and Prakriti, we see another line from Sri Aurobindo's small sonnet, God. Thou who pervadest all the worlds below, yet sittest above, master of all who work and rule and know, servant of love. I mean, this is a very short poem from Sri Aurobindo. There are only 2 stanzas. This is the first stanza I got here. But what caught me was this question of servant of love. So, thou who pervadest all the worlds below, the Godhead is so supreme, transcendent divinity, He pervades all the worlds, sits above, master of all who work, karma yoga, and rule and know. All these yogas, all these kinds of people, all the kings and kingdoms and common people. He is so supreme a transcendental being. And yet, what is the definition of the Godhead? The servant of love. So this is the beauty, the aspect that's being brought out in these lines here, that the divine is the servant of love. I mean, love in the human beings, love in the Prakriti. He showers this love everywhere. So look at this line which tell him, he adores her as his regent of desire. No, as one too great for him, he worships her. I mean, this is not the question of man, woman. It is the relation of the male, female. It's the relation of the Purusha and the Prakriti. So, the question here is not worshipping a woman or worshipping a wife or worshipping a lover. It's the worship of the Shakti. Is that energy he is worshipping, he adores her as his regent of desire. There is a question of worship, an element of adoration, one who fulfills his desire. He yields to her as the mover of his will, as the one who, he succumbs to her. He says, all right, you do whatever you want. Whatever his will, he says, is your will. He burns the incense of his nights and days, offering his life. So, in essence, what is it that we see here? I mean, Sri Aurobindo has given image after image, and further lines before I take up again. A rapt solicitor for her love and grace, his bliss in her to him is his whole world. He grows through her in all his being's powers. He reads by her God's hidden aim in things. Or a courtier in her countless retinue, content to be with her and feel her near, he makes the most of the little that she gives, and all she does drapes with his own delight. You see, these are lines, as I said, sometimes it's difficult to understand, because they verge almost on the human level, human relationship between man and woman. So we may get a little astray in understanding these lines, because you see, all these are applied on the human level too. A rapt solicitor for her love and grace, his bliss in her to him is his whole world. And then he grows through her. He's a courtier in her countless retinue, content to be with her and feel her near. Just all the time there is this intimacy, wanting to be with Prakriti, with the energy, with his counterpart. So he's kind of, he's no one, he's nobody. But then, what is the secret of this? Why is it that Purusha is leaving himself so much helplessly almost in the hands of Prakriti? So when we read this, we have, I have brought to you something from Sri Aurobindo because, as I said, it's difficult to understand this. So I sought an explanation of this in Sri Aurobindo. This is Sri Aurobindo's Letters on Yoga, volume 23. And page 797. Now, I'll take you to a different world, the world of Radha and Krishna, of the Gopikas. Because this kind of an intimate relation that is seen here, I'll just complete the stanza before I take it up. You see, but the same relation, the same imagery is there, so I can continue. He says, a glance can make his whole day wonderful, a glance from Prakriti. A glance can make his whole day wonderful, a word from her lips with happiness wings the hours. He leans on her for all he does and is. He builds on her largesses his proud fortunate days, and trails his peacock plumage joy of life, and suns in the glory of her passing smile. In 1,000 ways he serves her royal needs. He makes the hours pivot around her will, makes all reflect her whims. All is their play. This whole wide world is only he and she. An extraordinary description where the Supreme Purusha is all lost in Prakriti. And there are descriptions like to say, a word from her lips with happiness wings the hearts. A glance can make his whole day wonderful. You see, for us in India, we have seen such descriptions and maybe more with a greater intimacy, even on the physical level, in a poem called Geet Govinda by Jayadev. The poet is called, his name is Jayadev. And even otherwise we have lots of stories between Sri Krishna and Gopikas and Sri Krishna and Radha. So now we understand what Sri Aurobindo is depicting here is more or less the relationship of Radha and Krishna. And it is, as I told you months back, that we had been to a small town where it was supposed to be the village of Radha. So where she, like here, comes to the forefront. She is more important than Sri Krishna. So this question of Sri Krishna's relationship with the Gopikas, with Sri Radha, there are innumerable letters, but I picked up a couple of them, trying to throw light on what Sri Aurobindo has described here, which may, as I said, may be misunderstood, misread, but for that Sri Aurobindo's explanations are wonderful here. So in this volume 23, page 797, the gopis are the cowgirls, you must have heard of Sri Krishna's life story. He had a great charm. He used to play the flutes. And of course, all of the stories are not just stories, but the call of the flute, the response of the gopikas, the response of the people there, it has a deeper inner meaning. The call of the flute is the call of the divine. That means your soul's aspiration. And the gopikas, the cowgirls, of course, there's so much to say about each of these things. The cow itself is not a cow. It represents light. It represents the consciousness of light. And that means those girls That means those human beings who are open to this light. So somewhere there is a psychic opening. These are the cowgirls, these are the gopikas who respond to the call of the divine. That's the inner meaning. Otherwise, we have a lot of literature, all songs and dances in India are around Sri Krishna, Gopikas and Radha and all that. That's why our Indian dances and songs are so extraordinarily full of devotion, because all the time it is this inner aspiration. It is this call of the psychic being to the divine. So when we hear a song on the stage, we don't see the dancer as much as Radha herself or the Gopika herself. So here is the meaning. He says, the Gopikas are not ordinary people in the proper sense of the word. They are the embodiments of a spiritual passion, extraordinary by their extremeness of love, personal devotion, unreserved self-giving. So people want to be like the Gopikas, because this is nothing but what Sri Aurobindo and the Mother tell us about this absolute surrender. And what is beautiful is, what Sri Aurobindo is telling us today has been a reality of Indian spirituality centuries back, since the time of Sri Krishna, that the only ideal was to become a Gopika, one who is unreserved, self-giving, personal devotion, and extremeness of love. Whoever has that, however humble his or his position in other respects, learning, power of presentation, scholarship, external sanctity, etc., can easily follow after Krishna and reach him. That seems to me the sense of the symbol of the gopis. There are many other significances, of course. That is only one among many. So, now coming back to these lines, if we can link them up, it is the Purusha, the divine Sri Krishna, who is playing with these gopikas. You know, we have in Gujarat, what's that dance called? Garba. When we have this dance, it's extraordinarily beautiful, not as apart from being a lovely dance itself. The meaning is there are hundreds of ladies who are dancing, and with those hundreds of ladies, there are hundreds of Krishnas. Each one is dancing with the Krishna. There are not just one Krishna, but hundreds of Krishnas. As many Gopikas, so many Krishnas. The meaning is exactly this. The psychic being is being responded by the divine. It's not the love affair of one Krishna and one Gopika, or one Krishna and one Radha. A lot of Western people, especially in the present times, are purposely misinterpreting these Gopikas and the Radha and Krishna as Sri Krishna has been called a philanderer, that has got so many wives, he goes about with girls. You know, that there cannot be a greater perversion of this Indian spirituality than this kind of an explanation. I mean, it's a shallow understanding. If you see Sri Krishna with, maybe he is supposed to have 33,000 Gopikas. But it's not the girls, you see, it's the level of our consciousness. We see Gopikas as girls, and then they say Sri Krishna is a philanderer, he's a womanizer, he has not one wife. But look at the depth of this Indian stories, which have always, I'll read out something more also, where Sri Aurobindo tells us who these Gopikas are, and then he says, wonderful here, whoever has that inner aspiration, has that devotion, has that unreserved surrender, however humble his or her position in other respects. You see, these are the simple, not the cowgirls, but the simple aspirants from the heart. So he says, here learning, power of presentation, scholarship, external sanctity, don't bother. I mean, in one place, I've forgotten where I've seen that, he says Sri Krishna called these cowgirls and not Brahmins. I mean, when Sri Aurobindo read and said that, and there was an eye-opener. He says he didn't call the Brahmin girls, he called the cowgirls. So Brahmin is not the caste. It's those who really think much of themselves because of their learning, their scholarship, the power of presentation, external sanctity. He doesn't want all those intellects who cannot have this reach to the divine. And that's how the mother long back in 1970s, she wrote, I was there in Aspiration when the notice came, she said, the simple farmers or something. What is this quotation?
The essence of it was that Indian farmer is...
a simple Indian farmer is closer to God than the intellects of Europe.
Sophisticated
Something, I'm not quoting exactly, but this is the meaning. You see, wherever there is the intellect is the bar to divinity. It obstructs devotion. So when Sri Aurobindo said, Sri Krishna doesn't call the Brahmin girls but the cowgirls, it was great meaning. So that is the Gopikas, that is the sense of the involvement of the divine in this creation. And then there is one extraordinary poem I refer to, the relation of Radha and Krishna in a poem called Geet Govind. And I have read out some of these lines which are bordering sensuality. You see some of these lines about the lips and all that, in the glance, the word from her lips, and then in his sons in the glory of her passing smile. Everywhere there is a touch of the sensuality. And yet it is not the sensuous love. And this is most wonderfully caught in this poem by Jayadeva. He was there in the 12th century. And since then it has become so popular that even a kind of a creed was started by them. And here I just for sake of an example, long many years back, I discovered this Geet Govind, its essence and its beauty. This Sanskrit verses, in fact the translator, I don't have time but I wanted to tell you, this translator is a European. He has written that I have tried to capture the meaning, but it's impossible to capture into English the Sanskrit verses. The meaning is so sweet, so melodious, repetitive, but it has such double meaning that it cannot be captured in English. So he says, I'm doing my best, but he has himself given a long comment saying, this is something impossible, that English cannot catch the depth and the grace of this language of Sanskrit. Something. So here I brought to you just a taste of that in simple English. It's not sure even there's some other European. I found him, this is Radha who is saying, I found him in his forest's leafy home, him is Sri Krishna, in which in solitude he lies concealed. In looking round was frightened, till I saw his violent passion in abounding laughter. Why can't Keshi's foe, my friend, reform his ways and meet me in desiring him? At first meeting I was bashful, but his words were flattering and urgent, kind. He smiled and pressed me, and that cloth was loosed that left me standing with pudenda bare. Why can't Keshi's foe, my friend, reform his ways? How tenderly he treated me, as on my breast he quietly lay as one asleep. To me alone he gave his arms and kisses, played and drank there fully at my lip. Why can't Keshi's foe, my friend, reform his ways? In indolence my eyelids closed, I felt his cheeks enlarge and quicken, charming me. How tired the body was and drenched with sweat, with him in passion, riding to and fro. By all love's treatises he won his pleasure, like the cuckoo bird I cooed in murmurs. My massive breasts he scored with nail marks, made my hair go always as it dropped its flowers. My jeweled anklets jingled as it delved in love's complexities to pleasure me. I lost my girdle belt, he tore my hair, but gave me kisses violently. Resting, pleasured from that union, I with budded lotus eyes still close to me, with no more strength than has a creeper, felt in Madhu's enemy the love increase. So Madhu's enemy sings Jayadeva, ever moving, laughing in his sport. By him deserted, Radha knows such sadness as the tale and slowly makes its way. Of course, this is a very poor translation as I understand the author himself telling us. But this is just a little glimpse of love which verges on sensuality, on eroticism, and yet it surpasses so much. And to that extent, Sri Aurobindo himself comments here in one of his letters. He says the coming of sex on seeing the image of Krishna and Radha is due to the past association of sex with the cult of Radha and Radha Krishna. You see, a lot of people, especially the Westerners, take this poem to be only a sexual symbol. Because you have all the symbols of sensuality, sexuality, eroticism and everything. But Sri Aurobindo says no. But in fact, the image has nothing to do with sex. This is on page 796 of this volume. But in fact, the image has nothing to do with sex. The true symbol for it would not be the human sex attraction, but the soul, the psychic, hearing the call of the divine and flowering into the complete love and surrender that bring the supreme Ananda. That is what Radha and Krishna by their divine union bring about in the human consciousness, and it is so that you must regard it, throwing aside the old sex associations. You see, I was flabbergasted to see this very powerful sentence. In fact, the image has nothing to do with sex. So you see, it makes you think that here is a poem which is full of sex associations, and yet it says it's a question of your associations of your mind. But the poet has not written with sexuality in his mind. As Sri Aurobindo writes here, it's a hearing of the call of the divine and flowering into the complete love and surrender that brings the supreme Ananda. So it is not the physical pleasure, but the body becomes an instrument of manifesting the Ananda in the physical. So that was an extraordinary explanation. So he says that this question, it all depends, we have in the north Khajuraho temples, which are again thousands of poses of sexuality there. When I went and saw that, first I asked myself, why the sexuality on a temple? But then it struck me later that it depends on what level of consciousness you see that. You see, a lot of these tourist guides take the Westerners and then they show him the sex positions and all that. So they arouse the sexual sense in you, but a yogi or a saint would not look at them the same way. You see, even in Sri Aurobindo's poems, in Savitri, in Love and Death, there are descriptions of breasts and lips and kisses and all that. But it all goes to see what is the consciousness that responds. You see, a poet like Sri Aurobindo or somebody like Jayadeva, who was himself a great saint, he was not just a poet, by the way, a saint, a sage. But they use the physical but after all, the physical also is a reality. All the sensuality is not on the subtle physical, it's there on the physical. And yet there's a consciousness that doesn't, when you read Savitri and these poems, you don't get this vital sex aroused in you. It becomes a beautiful symbol of a union. Beyond there's something more. So here, that was the case of, and then why I'm emphasizing on all this is because this paragraph, this stanza here, has a lot of sensual, not sexual, imagery, and which may give us a wrong meaning. So that's what I want to emphasize. There's one more thing, of course, about Sri Krishna. This is a beautiful part of this book, Sadhana through love and devotion. So there are plenty of things about Sri Krishna if you want to read. But I would like to read one more letter that's on page 794. Sri Aurobindo writing to somebody, I have no objection at all to the worship of Krishna or the Vaishnava form of devotion, nor is there any incompatibility between Vaishnava bhakti and my supramental yoga. Some of us, the Aurobindonians, we kind of, look down upon other forms of devotion and saying, no, this has nothing to do with integral yoga, supramental yoga is different, and all this is old yogas. Some of us have taken Sri Aurobindo's words in a very narrow sense. In the sense we have taken words and quote them, but I'm afraid we do not understand them. We just, as Sri Aurobindo said, the mother has said, it's the old yoga. But here is a line that opens our eyes. It says, and nor is there any incompatibility between Vaishnava bhakti, this kind of a bhakti of devotion, of self-surrendering, offering to Sri Krishna. This is not devotion. And then this is the last, this is the immaculate sentence. There is in fact no special and exclusive form of supramental yoga. All ways can lead to the supermind, just as all ways can lead to the divine. Of course, I must have read it long back, but this time preparing for a class, I came across these lines again. And that is a big eye-opener. Because what does it mean when he says there's no special or exclusive form of supramental yoga? Then what is this integral yoga? Because we always believe that it's integral yoga that leads you to the supermind or supramental yoga. But it says there's no exclusive form. It could be Vaishnavism, it could be Shankarism, not Shankarism, of course, it's illusion. But any other form of surrender, of devotion, of dedication, and then all ways can lead to the supermind. It's a sentence that we need to ponder upon. Because there may have to be a kind of a revised understanding of our own understanding of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. We cannot be so very dogmatic saying integral yoga is the end, is the only way to supermind. Because here it says, all ways can lead to the supermind, just as all ways can lead to the divine. That's what Sri Ramakrishna had proved, and Sri Aurobindo said many a time, that there are as many ways to the divine as there are individuals. So, I think at least I would like to rethink about this question of integral yoga leading to supramental yoga, or integral yoga being, is it the supramental yoga in itself? And when it says there is no exclusive path of the supramental yoga, then what is the necessity of integral yoga? That's a question I need to ask myself. If it is a question in your minds, I think it's worth giving it a thought. And so this is the yoga that I was speaking about between Radha and Krishna. Now you see, I think I started telling you that all this description that we find are a specific relation between the divine and the creator. The divine losing himself in Prakriti, the divine responding to that aspiration, and where the mind could be a bar. So we have in Gita Govind an extreme form of the sensuality, and yet Sri Aurobindo says it has nothing to do with sex. So that was the experiment that was done in India, be it in sculptures, be it in poetry. There's always the higher levels beyond the sensuality. And here, Sri Aurobindo appeals to those higher levels, and that's why he can speak of all these things. Otherwise, I've heard people say how the divine becomes subservient to Prakriti and all that. But it's not that, there is a meaning. Now before I read the rest of the lines, let me complete the meaning part, otherwise you will not be able to connect it and appreciate it. You see, later in the same passage he would explain why this kind of a play where the divine Purusha gives himself to Prakriti. Now later he would say, I think I found the line just here. Conquering her, then is he most her slave, he is a dependent, all his means are hers. At last he wakes to a memory of self. No, that's not the line. Well, I'll come to that, whatever. But what he explains is that in the beginning, be it creation, be it the individual, we are not all the time thinking of the creation as my own birth, my own growth. You see, if you analyze it, what is it happening? That as we grow, we are more or less in the life energy, manifesting what I think is good, what is it that I want to do, what is good for my career, what is good for my earning my life. We don't think much of the inner being. It's always trying to express my desires, my needs, my whimsies, my fancies, my comforts, my desire. It's always the outer world. And the place of the psychic being or the psychic realization is very little. It's always, as Sri Aurobindo said, the divine, the psychic being forgets itself. Forgets itself in the sense it gives so much of liberty to Prakriti, to the outer nature. He just says, I'm inside, I'll just keep watching you. So years roll on, decades roll on, and we are going from one to the other, one experience, one good, one bad, one pleasure, one sorrow. It's all part of this external Prakriti. But then, in fact the lines will come later, when Prakriti has manifested itself sufficiently, he's kind of, the psychic being within us gives Prakriti to express itself to a point where our outer nature, where our ego thinks that I am the be-all and the end-all. The Prakriti feels that she is the supreme. The ego bloats up so much. But then at that point, when you think no end of yourself, then the soul, the psychic being, comes into play. He says, I have given you all the time to manifest. Because the psychic being is also interested in manifesting. He's not interested in making all of us saints and sannyasis and going to the forest. That is not manifestation. So the divine wants to express himself. So he says, go on. But then, the beauty is, in the beginning, the psychic being is silent as if he has forgotten why he has come. But then the Prakriti, after a point, it forgets why is he doing all that? Why is it that it's going after all its desires? It has fulfilled desires, it has fulfilled comforts, it has fulfilled everything. And then the psychic being says, look, now don't forget that you are here to express, manifest me. You are not manifesting yourself, your desires and wishes. You are here for my sake. I am the master. You are the expression. So Sri Aurobindo says, in this romantic relation, it's kind of very mundane sense, this is all the romance of between the Purusha and Prakriti. But when the marriage takes place, a couple of years have gone by, then the romance is not there. Then at least, in the present world, the man kind of starts demanding, saying, hey, I want this, I want that. That means this romance was necessary to give freedom to Prakriti, but then at a point, having won her, I think that's the word he uses, having won the trust of Prakriti, then Purusha says, now I will transform you. But you see, you cannot impose yourself on your wife or your spouse. You have to win her over by love, by giving, by surrender. And once you win the other person, then that other person can do what you want. So the psychic being purposely allows the outer nature to establish itself so that it gains the confidence that I am something of myself. And then the psychic being says, now that I have gained your confidence, it starts the transformation, it starts the change. And that is what the mother refers to, where she says the individual has first to become an instrument, something, somebody. You see, otherwise she says you are an amorphous being. You have no individuality. So this is the meaning where the psychic being allows the outer nature to become an individual. Once you become an individual, with your own self-confidence, with your own so-called personality, with your own image in the world and all that, then the psychic being says, you are an instrument, you are an individual, I would like you to become my instrument now. Till now you have been an individual at the service of your own ego. But now I'll use you as my instrument for manifesting my own aim in life. So this is the role of each one of us. That there is a psychic being within us, quiet, almost dormant, forgetful of itself, leaving our outer nature to blossom. And once it blossoms, then the psychic being, the divine, the Purusha says, now you come under my control. I will transform you. I will change you. I will make you an instrument for my purpose. But the unfortunate thing is, as Sri Aurobindo expresses, ego is the helper, ego is the bar. So in the beginning, we have to develop our ego, the individuality. But when you turn to spiritual life, the ego refuses to surrender itself. Refuses is very hard, very difficult to surmount it. But that is the work of the sadhana. But this is the process that Sri Aurobindo explains here on a higher spiritual level, on the cosmic level of the Purusha and Prakriti. But what I have explained to you in the light of Mother and Sri Aurobindo is on the individual level. The same thing happens. The outer being manifests first. It is given to manifest. Then there is the taking back of the supreme psychic being and governing it. But that is the process of yoga. Not that in every human being it happens, but that is the need, the necessity, the process of yoga. So that is the meaning here. One more or two pages actually, where slowly we see the psychic being drawing towards itself the outer nature. It doesn't let it go all the way through, but slowly it pulls it back. I think we'll have to stop at the place. And that's why the last line here is very meaningful. He says that he makes the hours pivot around her will, makes all reflect her whims. All is their play. This whole wide world is only he and she, only Purusha and Prakriti, the soul and the outer nature. So that's why the notion of the Leela, I explained to you last time. Leela, the foundation of this Leela is nothing but love. It is through love that this world is at play. So this is the Radha and Krishna, the eternal Radha and Krishna who are at play. It is not a human lover, it is not a common woman. We have to understand Radha and Krishna in this manner, that we have all to become Radhas actually. Because Radha is one who has completely surrendered herself. We have Mother's own Radha's prayer, where there's an absolute surrender to even to this level of the cells. So Mother speaks of a higher level, but the Radha of Krishna here is a psychic being. Yeah, we will stop at that.